The day they burned our sky. The first thing I remember is the sound. Not the fire, not the screaming, not the buildings falling. The sound. A low, deep hum that started somewhere above the clouds and pushed down through the air like a hand pressing on your chest. I was 12 years old, crouched inside a concrete shelter beneath our house in Lagos, and I thought the sky itself was groaning. My mother had her arms around me. She was an engineer. She had built that shelter herself, dug the foundations with 2 neighbors on a weekend 3 years before, when the Galactic Council first announced that a hegemony survey fleet had passed through our outer solar system. She had not panicked then. She had not panicked now. She simply held me, and she counted the intervals between each impact, and when I looked up at her face, she was not crying. She was calculating. I did not understand that then. I understand it completely now. My name is Yara Osei. I am commander of the Earth Expeditionary Vessel Clarity, and I am 42 years old, and I have spent 30 years thinking about that sound. The Vorkai hegemony announced their orbital strike on the morning of a Tuesday. There was no warning delivered to the Galactic Council. There was no ultimatum sent to Earth's government. There was a broadcast, short and without emotion, transmitted simultaneously to every council member world, stating that the Vorkai hegemony was exercising what they called resource sovereign rights over the third planet of the Sol system. They cited a council provision, Article 12, subsection F, which allowed a registered hegemony to claim uninhabited resource territories. The key word, as every alien lawyer and delegate knew, was uninhabited. Earth was not uninhabited. 8 billion people lived on Earth. The council did not dispute the classification. They simply noted it, filed it, and scheduled a debate for the following quarter. The strikes hit 3 cities in the first wave: Lagos, Mumbai, and Chengdu. Not military installations. Not government buildings. Residential zones, near confirmed deposits of a rare element called Varith-6, which the Vorkai used to power their faster-than-light drives. The strikes were precise. They cleared the surface above those deposits without touching the deposits themselves. In military terms, it was elegant work. In human terms, it was something else entirely. Something I will not call elegant and will not call acceptable and will not describe with soft language. 412,000 people were gone in 11 minutes. I survived because my mother had built a shelter. I survived because she had calculated, 3 years before the strike, that something like this was possible. She had not told me why she built it. She had not wanted to frighten me. But she had built it, quietly, on a weekend, and that shelter is the reason I am alive today and not a name on a memorial wall. When the humming stopped, we came up from the shelter, and the sky was orange. Not sunset orange. Something deeper and slower, like the air itself had been heated from above and had not yet decided to cool. There was dust everywhere. Fine, pale dust that settled on my arms and on my mother's hair and tasted like chalk and something metallic I could not name. The street was intact. Our house was intact. 2 blocks north, there was nothing. Just a flat, gray space where a neighborhood had been. My mother stood at the edge of that space and looked at it for a long time. She did not cry then either. She took my hand, and she said one sentence. She said, in a very quiet voice, "You are going to be an engineer, Yara, or a soldier, or both, and either way, you are going to remember this exact moment for the rest of your life." I chose soldier. I also became an engineer. She was right on both counts. Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council at that time was a retired botanist named Dr. Remy Adeyemi. He was 71 years old and had spent 40 years studying soil microbiomes on 4 continents before being appointed to the diplomatic post because, as the appointment committee noted, he had never in his career raised his voice in anger at anyone, which they considered a diplomatic virtue. What they did not know, and what I have since come to understand, was that a man who has never raised his voice is not a man without anger. He is a man who has found a better place to put it. Dr. Adeyemi stood in the Galactic Council chamber 3 days after the strikes. The chamber was enormous, a ring-shaped structure orbiting a neutral moon between 2 council member systems. Every seat was filled. He was the smallest figure in the room. He was the only human in the room. He stood at the floor podium, and the translation system hummed to life above his head, and every alien delegate leaned slightly forward in the way that species lean forward when they expect either a plea or a performance. He gave them neither. He said, in an even and perfectly level voice, "We note the vote." Then he returned to his seat. The chamber was silent for perhaps 4 seconds. Several delegates exchanged looks. The Vorkai representative, a large and armored being named Velhast, tilted his head in the posture his species used when they found something mildly amusing. He would not find things mildly amusing for much longer in his career, but he did not know that yet. What no one in that chamber understood, and what I am only now able to speak about openly, was that those 3 words, "We note the vote," were not an expression of resignation. They were the start of a timer. And Dr. Adeyemi, who had studied living systems his entire life, understood something about timers that most diplomats do not. The most dangerous kind is the one that makes no noise. Earth went quiet after that. Officially. On paper. In the council records and in the Vorkai occupation logs and in every diplomatic channel, Earth was cooperative, subdued, and grateful for the generous terms of resource extraction being offered. Humans showed up to work in the Vorkai administrative offices and maintenance facilities with clean uniforms and punctual arrival times. They answered every question accurately. They filed every report correctly. Underground, and I mean that in both the literal and practical sense, every engineer, physicist, materials scientist, and military strategist humanity had ever produced began the longest and most focused project in the history of our species. My mother was one of them. She did not tell me for 6 years. When she finally did, she did not explain everything. She explained only what I needed to know to do my part. That was the design of the whole thing. No one knew the complete picture. 5 people in a bunker beneath the city of Johannesburg knew the complete picture, and they had agreed among themselves that if any of them were ever taken and questioned, the others would simply continue without them. Velhast, the Vorkai representative, flew back to his home system on a council transport and had a fine dinner and probably never thought about Dr. Adeyemi again. 30 years later, he would remember that chamber, and that sentence, and that small quiet man at the podium, and understand exactly what he had failed to see. But that comes later. What matters now is this: they thought silence meant defeat. They had never encountered a species that uses silence as a tool. They had never sat across a table from something patient enough to wait 30 years for the right moment. They had never looked into a human face and understood that behind the cooperating and the nodding and the punctual reports, there was a calculation running. Constant, cold, and completely without mercy. My mother built a shelter on a weekend because she saw something coming. Humanity built something far larger, in the dark, for far longer, for the same reason. They burned our sky. We remembered the exact temperature, and we got to work. 30 years of quiet. Son Adebayo had been working as a senior logistics coordinator for the Vorkai Hegemony's Regional Fleet Command for 11 years when Admiral Grethval asked him why humans worked such long hours voluntarily. They were sitting in the Admiral's office on the orbital station above the asteroid belt humanity called the Shepherd's Band, which the Vorkai had renamed something that translated roughly to Resource Corridor 7. It was late by the station's clock cycle. Son had been there since the early shift. He had a coffee mug on the edge of the desk and a data tablet in his lap and the particular expression of a man who is very comfortable exactly where he is. Admiral Grethval was not a cruel being. This is worth saying clearly, because the story of the occupation is not a story of monsters. It is, in some ways, a more unsettling story than that. Grethval was efficient, fair by his own culture's standards, occasionally thoughtful, and entirely convinced that humanity had accepted their situation and moved forward. He had governed Resource Corridor 7 for 9 years without a single human incident worth reporting. His human staff were reliable. His maintenance crews were extraordinary. The systems they serviced ran better under human hands than they had under any previous arrangement. He considered this a point of personal pride in his management style. He was not wrong that the systems ran well. He was entirely wrong about the reason. Son looked up from his tablet when the Admiral asked his question. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that is warm and genuine and reveals nothing. He said, "We just love to be useful, sir." Admiral Grethval found this charming. He noted it in a personal log he kept about interesting cultural observations. He used the word earnest to describe it. He went to sleep that night feeling good about his command. Son Adebayo finished his shift, walked to his quarters, locked the door, and began encoding the week's intelligence package for transmission through a signal buried inside the standard maintenance diagnostic feed that went out every 3 days. It contained the complete updated schematics of the Vorkai Fleet Command's FTL drive calibration systems, the patrol rotation for the next 60 days, and the access codes for the station's secondary communication array, which Humanity's signals team had been reading for 14 months. He was not angry when he did this. That is the thing I want you to understand about the people who carried this plan through 30 years. They were not burning with rage every day. Rage is exhausting. Rage makes you sloppy. What they carried instead was something quieter and more durable. Purpose. The kind that does not need to announce itself. The kind that gets up every morning and does the work. I was not Son. I was not in the intelligence stream. I was in the engineering program, which had a different role and a different kind of patience required. I want to tell you about both sides of what we built, because neither half makes sense without the other. On the intelligence side, by year 15 of the occupation, Humanity had 200 operatives embedded across 60 alien governments, council administrative offices, and hegemony military installations. None of them had been recruited through dramatic secret meetings in dark corridors. Most of them had simply applied for jobs, worked hard, made themselves indispensable, and then began, quietly and carefully, to pay attention to everything around them. Humans are extraordinarily good at being underestimated. We have been doing it on our own planet for thousands of years. We understand, in a way that species who have never been conquered do not, how much a person in a subordinate position can learn simply by being present and unremarkable. Every trade route used by the Vorkai hegemony was documented by year 12. Every fleet position, updated weekly by year 16. Every council communication protocol, fully mapped by year 19. A human woman named Claire Norton, who worked as a transcription assistant in the Galactic Council's administrative offices, produced a complete record of every closed-session security debate for 9 years by memorizing the contents of documents she was handed to file and writing them down each evening from memory. She had perfect recall. She had listed this on her application as a useful clerical skill. Nobody had thought to ask what else she might do with it. On the engineering side, I can speak more directly. The plan required ships. Not vessels borrowed from alien manufacturers. Not retrofitted cargo haulers with borrowed weapons. Ships designed by humans, built by humans, using materials and methods that the hegemony did not know we had. This required shipyards. Building a shipyard in secret is exactly as difficult as it sounds, and it took us 7 years to solve the problem before we built a single hull. The solution was the asteroid belt. The Shepherd's Band runs along the outer edge of our solar system's habitable zone. It is dense, irregular, and enormously difficult to survey comprehensively. The Vorkai ran standard sweeps every 18 months. Those sweeps looked for energy signatures, heat output, and communication emissions. They did not find our shipyards because our engineers had spent 4 years developing construction methods that produced none of the above in detectable quantities. Cold assembly. Passive power systems during construction. Communication through tight beam relays buried in the rock itself, bouncing signals along paths the Vorkai scanners were not angled to catch. 14 shipyards. That was the final count. Each one building a different component or subsystem, with final assembly happening in 2 deep rock facilities that were only activated in the last 4 years of the program. The workers rotated in and out on long cycles. No one stayed long enough to see the whole picture. They knew their piece. They trusted the 5 people in Johannesburg to know the rest. I joined the engineering program in year 8, when I was 20 years old. I had completed my military training, passed the technical examinations, and been selected for assignment to a fabrication team working on propulsion systems in a facility hollowed out of an asteroid the Vorkai charts listed as empty and uninteresting. I spent 6 years there. I learned things about FTL mechanics that our species had not known 30 years before, because we had learned them from the inside of the machines we had been hired to service and repair. Reverse engineering is not theft. It is listening. We listened to the hegemony's technology with great care for 30 years. In year 23, a Vorkai garrison commander named Ashtil grew suspicious. He was younger than most of the occupation officers, sharper, and had a habit of noticing things that did not quite fit. He ordered a comprehensive sweep of human activity in 3 regions, including parts of the asteroid belt. He authorized additional scanner passes, unannounced inspections of human maintenance facilities, and a review of 3 years of human personnel movement records. He found nothing. He did not find nothing because there was nothing to find. He found nothing because 3 months before his sweep began, a human analyst working in the hegemony's own scheduling office noticed the pattern of his requests and recognized what it meant. She filed a routine administrative correction on a travel record, which triggered a notification to the Johannesburg team, which initiated the quiet movement of equipment and personnel to secondary locations that had been prepared specifically for this scenario. Oshtiel filed a report stating that his concerns had not been substantiated. He was transferred to a quieter posting the following year. His superiors found his suspicion evidence of anxiety rather than competence. They noted in his file that he had a tendency to overanalyze routine data. This was, in retrospect, an extremely costly assessment error on their part. In year 27, I was transferred from fabrication to operations. I had been selected for command track. I trained for 3 years on simulators that the general public of Earth did not know existed. I flew exercises against other human pilots in ships that had never broken atmosphere, because we were not yet ready for anyone to see them. I learned the tactical doctrine that our strategists had developed over 2 decades, specifically designed to counter Vorkai fleet response patterns, which we knew in precise detail because we had watched them practice those patterns for 30 years. The ships were extraordinary. I say that not with pride but with simple accuracy. We had taken 30 years and the combined engineering minds of a civilization that had been highly motivated, and we had produced something that no other species in the Council would have believed possible from a pre-emergent world. They were lean and fast and quiet in ways that Vorkai design philosophy had never prioritized, because Vorkai design philosophy assumed that your enemy could see you coming. Our ships were built on the opposite assumption. By year 29, the fleet was complete. The intelligence network was complete. The operational plan had been rehearsed until every person involved could carry out their role in the dark, underwater, in absolute silence. We were ready for 2 years before we moved. We did not move for 2 years, because the plan required a specific trigger, and we had agreed, all of us, that we would not move until that trigger was met. We had come too far to act on impatience. We had spent 30 years teaching ourselves not to act on impatience. Then the Vorkai announced a second bombardment. And we moved. The reckoning begins. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning, transmitted to every council member world in the standard hegemony broadcast format, the same calm and toneless delivery they had used 30 years before. The Vorkai hegemony was announcing an expanded resource extraction initiative. There was a phrase in the middle of the document that their legal team had clearly spent time crafting, something about residual population displacement for operational efficiency. It was a long phrase that meant a short and terrible thing. They were going to hit populated areas again. I was in the operations center of the Clarity when the broadcast came through. My crew read it in silence. No one stood up. No one raised their voice. My navigation officer, a man named Oliver Dane, set his coffee down very carefully on the edge of his console, and then he looked at me, and I looked at him, and that was the entire conversation we needed to have. At the Galactic Council chamber, Earth's new ambassador was a man named Daniel Adeyemi, the grandson of Dr. Remy Adeyemi, the botanist who had stood at that same podium 30 years before and said we note the vote. Daniel was 34 years old. He had his grandfather's stillness and his grandmother's eyes and a voice that carried without needing volume. He stood at the floor podium while every delegate in the chamber watched, expecting, as delegates always expect from the smaller party, either a plea or an outburst. He gave them 4 sentences. He said, "Humanity formally withdraws its recognition of Resolution 7 as applicable to this body, effective immediately. We consider this matter no longer within the Council's jurisdiction. We thank the Council for its decades of observation. And we wish everyone a productive session." Then he sat down, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a small device, and switched off his translation unit. Every delegate in the room heard the soft click of it powering down. In the silence that followed, a Vorkai legal aide leaned over to the senior delegate and said something that the Council translators recorded but that nobody in the chamber believed they needed to worry about. He said, "Do you think they actually have something?" The senior delegate did not answer. He was already looking at his communication screen, because something was happening in Vorkai home system space, and it was not what any scenario projection had prepared him for. 14 ships had come out of faster-than-light transit simultaneously. Not near the Vorkai military installations. Not near the planetary defenses. Near the communication relays, the 7 relay stations that connected the Vorkai hegemony's 9 systems to each other and to the rest of the galactic communication network. The ships were unlike anything in any registry. They had no hegemony marking. They had no council classification code. They were dark-hulled, low in profile, and absolutely silent on every scanner frequency the Vorkai used. The Vorkai defense net flagged them, tried to categorize them, and failed. The automated response system sent a challenge signal. It received no answer. The system escalated to the Garrison Fleet Command, which scrambled a response wing, which flew toward the intruder coordinates at standard intercept speed. By the time the response wing arrived, the 14 ships had done what they came to do. They had not fired a single weapon. Not one. Instead, they had broadcast. Every Vorkai communication frequency, every council relay, every open channel in the quadrant received the same transmission simultaneously. It ran for 6 hours without pause. It contained the complete documented record of everything the Vorkai hegemony had done on Earth over 30 years. Not summaries. Not accusations. Documentation. Coordinates of every strike. Timestamps precise to the second. Names. 412,000 names from the first wave, catalogued by age and neighborhood and the last recorded location of each person before the strike reached them. The names of every person displaced from their home in the occupation years. The records of every resource extraction authorization, cross-referenced with the zones where humans had been living before the authorization was filed. 6 hours of truth, transmitted to everyone who had ever claimed they did not know. The Vorkai response wing reached the 14 ships and found them waiting calmly, in formation, with their hulls dark and their weapons cold. The wing commander transmitted a demand for identification. She received a response in perfect Vorkai standard, delivered without accent, because our communications team had spent 8 years learning Vorkai standard the way they learned everything else, carefully, completely, and without telling anyone who did not need to know. The response said, "We are the Earth Expeditionary Fleet. We will depart this system when the transmission completes. If you fire on us before it completes, we will not depart." The wing commander did not fire. She was a professional, and she understood when the geometry of a situation was not in her favor. She held her position, and she watched, and she waited, and for 6 hours, every being in 9 Vorkai systems heard the names of the people who had been in Lagos and Mumbai and Chengdu on a Tuesday morning 30 years before. While the 14 ships held the Vorkai Defense Force's attention, the rest of the operation was already running. I was not with the 14 ships. I want to be clear about what my role was, because the 14 ships were the visible part, and the visible part is never the whole story. I commanded a strike team of 9 vessels operating on the opposite side of Vorkai space. Our targets were not the communication relays. Our targets were the military shipyards, specifically the construction and dry dock facilities where the Vorkai built and maintained their fleet. There were 11 of them across 6 systems. Our team had been assigned 4. I want to tell you that what we did felt dramatic and fierce and full of fire. It did not feel that way. It felt like a technical exercise that we had run many times in simulation and were now running for the first time in reality. We moved on precise timing. We used the Vorkai FTL signature profiles, which we had studied and copied, to disguise our approach as routine hegemony fleet traffic. We arrived at each target facility inside their own identification window. By the time their systems recognized us as not them, we were already done. We did not destroy the shipyards. I want to be specific about this, because there is an important difference between destroying and disabling, and the plan had made that distinction very deliberately. We disabled every construction system, every dry dock mechanism, every fabrication line. We hit the power infrastructure that ran the facilities, the data systems that managed the inventory, and the communication links that connected each yard to the Hegemony Fleet Command. We did not touch the workers. We did not touch the housing or the life support or any civilian system. We put signs, in Vorkai standard, on every disabled panel we left behind. The signs said, "We will restore this when the hegemony restores what it took." Our 4 targets took 38 minutes total. I remember checking the time at the end and thinking that my mother's shelter had taken longer to build. I told Oliver, my navigation officer, to plot our extraction. He said, without looking up from his console, "Already done, Commander." I sat back in my chair and thought about Lagos. In the council chamber, the feed from Vorkai space was playing on the secondary screens, because someone on the council communications staff had routed it there before being told not to. Every delegate in the room was watching in the particular stillness of beings who had just discovered that a situation is much larger than they had assessed. A mid-tier delegate from a species called the Arath leaned to his aide and asked how large the human fleet actually was. The aide checked the transmission logs and the scanner reports and came back with a number. The delegate read it twice and then set the report face down on his desk, which was his species' equivalent of needing a moment. By hour 7, the Vorkai High Command was requesting a ceasefire communication channel. They had transmitted the request to the Earth Diplomatic Office. The Earth Diplomatic Office, which had been staffed and ready for exactly this moment, sent back a single line: "We do not have a ceasefire channel. We built a resolution channel. Please specify whether you wish to use it." The Vorkai High Command stared at that response for a long time. They had expected anger and received structure. They had expected chaos and received a filing system. They had spent 30 years looking at humanity and thinking they understood the shape of it, and in the space of one Tuesday, they had discovered that they had been looking at a door and calling it a wall. The transmission ended on schedule. The 14 ships went dark, accelerated to FTL, and were gone before the Vorkai response wing could do anything about it. They left no debris, no trace, no record of entry that the hegemony could use for any counterfiling with the Council. They left only silence, and in the silence, 6 hours of names. Oliver Dane said, quietly, from the navigation console, "I think that went well, Commander." I said, "Log it and go get some sleep." He went. I stayed at my station for a while longer. I looked at the star field on the forward display, and I thought about a 12-year-old girl in a shelter beneath a house in Lagos, listening to a sound from above the clouds. I thought, we are not done. But the first part was done, and it had worked, and the numbers matched the plan, and the plan had been 30 years in the making. I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not quite pride but was close to it. Then I pulled up the next phase briefing and got to work. The Council discovers fear. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called within 4 hours of the Vorkai transmission ending. It was not called for humanity's benefit. It was called because 31 of the 47 Council member species had sent simultaneous requests for clarification, and the Council chair, a being named Velthran, needed somewhere to put the conversation before it spread to places that were harder to manage. I watched the opening of that session from the Clarity's communications suite, sitting in a chair that I had pulled close to the screen and had not moved from in 2 hours. Oliver was beside me. My communications officer, a young woman named Grace Fuller, was monitoring 7 feed streams simultaneously and making notes. She had the focused expression of someone who finds extraordinary events primarily interesting from a technical standpoint, which is exactly the kind of person you want in that chair during an extraordinary event. Velthran opened the session with a prepared statement. It was long and used many formal phrases and was, in its essential content, a condemnation. The words disproportionate and destabilizing appeared multiple times. The phrase unilateral action without Council authorization appeared 4 times. Velthran delivered it in the measured tone of someone who has practiced it and believes that tone is the same as authority. Grace Fuller looked up from her notes and said, without particular inflection, "They just called us destabilizing." I said, "They are not wrong." She thought about this for a moment and then went back to her notes. What Velthran did not address in his prepared statement, and what the chamber began to figure out on its own as the session proceeded, was the question of scale. The 14 ships. The shipyard operations. The intelligence depth implied by the precision of the strike timing. The broadcast, 6 hours long, containing records that the Vorkai had never admitted to keeping and that no outside party had ever been confirmed to possess. Someone had been collecting that information for a long time. Someone had been building those ships for a long time. Someone had been planning this for a very, very long time. The question, which spread from delegate to delegate the way a question does when it makes everyone in the room equally uncomfortable, was, how long? The Council's Intelligence Office produced a report. They had begun assembling it within an hour of the first transmissions and had rushed it to the chamber floor by the end of the first break. The report was 43 pages long. I have since read it. It is, from my perspective, somewhat flattering, though it also contains several errors and one spectacular misunderstanding of our propulsion architecture that I found mildly funny. The report was placed before the full chamber and read aloud in summary by an intelligence officer who had clearly not slept and whose voice had taken on the particular quality of someone delivering information that they personally wish were different. The summary included our fleet strength, our operational reach, the depth of our intelligence network, partially reconstructed from behavioral patterns and communication anomalies across 3 decades of Council records. The number of human operatives identified as likely embedded in Council and hegemony administrative systems, which was not the full number but was enough to produce an audible reaction in the chamber when it was read aloud. Then the intelligence officer reached the estimate of how long the program had been running, and the chamber went quiet in a different way. 30 years, the officer said. Approximately. Possibly longer in the foundational phase. A delegate from the Marith Federation, a large and generally composed being who had represented her species on the Council for 19 years, put her hands flat on her desk and stared at the officer without speaking. The delegate beside her whispered something. She did not respond to it. She was doing what beings do when a piece of information requires them to revise a large number of previous assumptions simultaneously. The Vorkai senior delegate, who had been sitting with his legal team in the respondent section since the session opened, was engaged in his own revision. He was looking at the chamber floor and thinking about 30 years of human employees who showed up on time, filed correct reports, made no complaints, asked for nothing unusual, and maintained his fleet system so well that his own engineers had complimented their work in quarterly reviews. He thought about Admiral Grethval, who had found his human staff charming, and the word earnest in a personal log, and the particular quality of a smile that reveals nothing. And then a thing happened that no one in that chamber had prepared for. From the press gallery on the upper tier, where accredited observers and translators sat during open sessions, a young woman leaned across to a Marith delegate's aide who had been whispering questions to his colleague. She leaned over and answered his question directly, in Marith Standard, which is not a language that humans are widely known to speak. She answered it in his dialect, which is specific to a region of the Marith homeworld that no human had officially visited in 40 years. The aide froze. He looked at her. She looked at him. She nodded politely and sat back in her chair and returned to her notes. The aide turned to his delegate. He said, in a low voice, in a subdialect of Marith Standard that is essentially a private family language used within his specific regional government, "How many of our languages do they speak?" The woman in the press gallery did not look up from her notes. She said, quietly, "Enough." The chamber had not heard this exchange. But word of it moved around the room in about 6 minutes, which is fast even for a council session. By the time Daniel Adeyemi was formally admitted to the floor to deliver humanities terms, every delegate in the room had heard the story, and the story had done something to the texture of the silence in that chamber that no prepared speech could have accomplished. Daniel Adeyemi was 34 years old and wore a plain suit and carried nothing with him to the podium. He stood in the same spot where his grandfather had stood 30 years before and said, "We note the vote." He did not say anything for 10 seconds. He looked around the chamber slowly, without theatrics, the way a person looks around a room when they are simply making sure they have everyone's attention. Then he said, "We have 3 requirements. The first is reparations from the Vorkai hegemony, to be paid to the human government in a form and over a timeline that we will specify separately. The details are not for this chamber. The principle is. The second is the formal revision of Resolution 7. The provision allowing resource classification of inhabited worlds must be removed. We will accept no partial amendment. The provision goes entirely. The third is a permanent human seat on the Council's security chamber." He paused there. Because the security chamber is where the vote had happened. The vote that had watched 412,000 people disappear on a Tuesday morning and called it a resource dispute. The security chamber, and its members, and the faces behind the vote that had classified Earth's dead as a non-interference situation. He said, "We are not here to end this council. We are here to correct it. Those are different objectives, and we want to be certain that every delegate in this room understands the difference before you respond to our terms." He said, "Take whatever time you need." Then he returned to his seat and sat with his hands folded on the desk in front of him, looking at nothing in particular, with the patience of someone whose family had been practicing this particular kind of patience for 30 years. In the observer gallery, Grace Fuller had closed her notes and was watching the chamber feed on a small screen. I was on the Clarity, watching the same feed, counting seconds. The chamber was silent for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know because I counted. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of 47 species, each running their own internal calculation. Each weighing what they had seen against what they had assumed. Each remembering their own vote, or their own silence, or their own decision not to raise a formal objection when a planet had been struck from above on a Tuesday morning. The Arath delegate who had set the intelligence report face down on his desk, in his species equivalent of needing a moment, was the first to speak. He did not speak to the chamber. He spoke to his own aide, in a voice not quite low enough to be private, and he said, "We should have asked, 20 years ago, what they were building." No one disagreed with him. The council voted on humanity's terms 14 hours later. The vote was not unanimous. It rarely is, in councils, for anything. But it was sufficient, and the provisions passed, and Resolution 7 was formally struck from the Galactic legal record at 4 a.m. by the council's synchronized clock, while most of the delegates were asleep and the chamber was empty, and the only people still watching the feed were the ones who had spent 30 years making sure this moment would arrive. Oliver Dane brought me a coffee at 4:15. He sat down beside me and looked at the screen. He said, "Well, that's done, then." I said, "The easy part." He thought about that for a while. Then he nodded. What silence sounds like. The reparation ceremony was not held in the council chamber. It was held on Earth, in Lagos, in the open square that had been built over the site of the neighborhood that no longer existed. The square was paved with a pale stone and had a long wall along one side where the names had been carved, all 412,000 of them, in letters small enough to read only if you stood close and looked with intention. It was not a monument designed to be photographed from a distance. It was designed to require presence. I was not at the ceremony. I was in the old residential district 2 kilometers north, standing on a street I had not walked since I was 12 years old. The buildings were different. They had been rebuilt 3 times in 30 years, and the most recent version was taller and lighter than the original and had gardens on the upper balconies. The street itself was the same width, the same curve, the same slight downhill grade toward the water. Some things in cities are stubborn that way. They stay even when everything above them changes. I stood there for a while. I was not there for any official reason. My command duties had been suspended for 2 weeks of personal leave, which was the military's way of saying, "You have been operating at high tension for a long time, and you should go somewhere quiet before you forget what quiet feels like." The street was quiet. It was morning. Someone was cooking something nearby, and the smell of it reached me before I could identify the source, and for a moment I was 12 years old again, coming up from the shelter, and the sky was orange, and my mother's hand was in mine. My mother was alive. She was 71 years old and lived in a small house in the hills east of the city and had retired from the engineering program 2 years before with a classification that would remain sealed for another decade. She had called me the morning after the council vote, and we had talked for an hour about nothing in particular, which is its own kind of thing. She asked me if I was eating properly. I told her I was. She did not believe me, but she let it go. I thought about her as I stood on that street. I thought about a woman who had built a shelter in the ground because she saw something coming, and then had spent 30 years helping build something that might make shelters unnecessary. I thought about the specific kind of person who does that. Who does not wait for permission, who does not wait for someone else to solve the problem, who looks at a situation and asks, "What can I build?" and gets to work. I was still standing there when my communication device signaled. It was a text message from Daniel Adeyemi. It said, "The Vorkai envoy has arrived. He would like to meet with operational command leadership when you're available." I wrote back, "Give me an hour." I stood on that street for 1 more hour. I watched the city move around me. Deliveries being made. Children going somewhere. A man repairing a section of pavement with the focused concentration of someone who finds the work completely sufficient. An ordinary morning in a city that had once had an orange sky and had decided, over 30 years, to become ordinary again. Then I went to meet the Vorkai envoy. His name was Kale. He was young, maybe 20 years old by Vorkai reckoning, which put him at roughly equivalent to a human of 18 or 19. He had been assigned as his species' first reparations liaison, which meant that someone in the Vorkai government had selected the youngest and least senior person they could find for a job that nobody more experienced wanted. This was either strategic or cowardly, and looking at him when he walked into the meeting room, I thought it was probably both. He was visibly afraid. This was not unusual. We had become aware, through intelligence reports and through the simple observation of council delegates in the weeks since the operation, that humanity had acquired a reputation that was somewhat larger than we had intended. Stories grow in the telling. By the time a story has traveled through 47 species and their associated press networks and diplomatic grapevines, what was a precise and carefully measured operation becomes something closer to legend, and legends have a tendency to be frightening in proportion to how little the listener understands the thing they are imagining. Cale stood in the doorway of the meeting room and looked at me and at Daniel Adeyemi and at Oliver Dane, who had come along because I had asked him to, and his hands were not quite steady. I said, in Vorkai standard, because I had been learning it for 11 years, please come in. Sit wherever you like. The expression on his face when I spoke his language was very specific. It was the expression of someone who has been told something is true but still finds it startling to encounter the truth directly. He sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table, which is a Vorkai gesture of peaceful intent, and he looked at me with the careful attention of someone who is trying very hard to be professional and is aware that they are also very young. I made tea. I did this because my mother always made tea when she sat down to talk about difficult things, and because it is a human habit that takes up exactly the right amount of time and gives everyone's hands something to do. I set a cup in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, in Vorkai standard, and then corrected himself and said it in English, which surprised me more than anything else he could have done, you did not have to do that. I said, no, but I wanted to. We sat down and began the work of reparations, which is slower and more detailed and more exhausting than any military operation. There are no clean moments in reparations. There are no clear victories. There is only the long process of accounting, of putting numbers to things that resist being numbered, of sitting across a table from someone who represents something enormous and complicated and trying to move, together, toward something that resembles correction. Cale was diligent. He was honest in a way that surprised me, given his position. When he did not know an answer, he said so. When a figure did not match what he had been given, he flagged it rather than smoothing it over. He worked long hours and asked careful questions, and on the third day, during a break, he sat beside me in the small courtyard outside the meeting building and looked at the sky and asked me a question. He said, "Why didn't you finish it?" I looked at him. I said, "Finish what?" He said, "The Vorkai hegemony. You had the capability. The fleet positioning alone, combined with the intelligence reach your people demonstrated. You could have ended us as a political entity. You chose not to. I have been trying to understand why." He was asking this genuinely. Not as a challenge. Not as a political probe. As a young person who is looking at a situation and cannot quite reconcile the strategy with what he has been taught about how power operates. I thought about how to answer him. I thought about what my mother would have said. I thought about Dr. Remy Adeyemi, who had built a career on not raising his voice, and what that had actually been about. I said, because that is what you would have done to us. And we spent 30 years making sure we would never become you. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, that is a very specific kind of discipline. I said, it is the only kind that lasts. He thought about this. Then he asked if he could have more tea. I said yes. The reparations process took 14 months to complete. I was not involved in all of it. My role narrowed as the legal and financial frameworks took over from the operational phase, which is as it should be. I spent time on Earth. I spent time on the clarity. I spent time doing the kind of quiet nothing that you forget how to do when you have been purposeful for too long. I thought often about the shape of what we had done. Not the operation itself, but the full 30 years of it. The operatives who had shown up to work every morning in offices they were slowly reading. The engineers who had assembled ships in cold and dark facilities inside rocks, trusting people they would never meet to know the full extent of what they were building. The intelligence analysts who had memorized documents by lamplight and slept with the weight of information that no one else could know. The 5 people in the Johannesburg bunker. I thought about what it takes to hold a wound for 30 years without letting it change you into something defined only by the wound. Because that is the real discipline. Not the engineering. Not the intelligence gathering. Not even the operation itself, which was, in the end, a technical exercise carried out by people who had prepared for it thoroughly. The real discipline was 30 years of choosing, every single day, not to become what had been done to you. Other species, the Council reports noted afterward, had faced similar situations in galactic history. Resource seizures. Occupations. Strikes on populated zones. Some had reacted immediately and been crushed by superior force. Some had accepted permanent subordination. Some had reacted in ways that produced consequences they had not calculated and suffered for it. None of them, in the recorded history that the Council maintains, had responded the way humanity had. One Council historian, a careful and precise being who specialized in pre-emergent species development, wrote a paper about it that circulated widely in the months after the session. The paper was titled, in rough translation, Patience as Strategy, and its central argument was that humanity had demonstrated a form of long-term collective planning that was categorically different from any previously documented example. Not because the individual elements were unprecedented, but because the combination, sustained over 3 decades without fracture, without leak, without a single defection or critical error, represented something that the Council's models of pre-emergent behavior had not included as a possible outcome. The historian noted that humanity had 174 years of recorded contact with galactic civilization at the time of the operation. He noted that for most of that period, humanity had been classified as cooperative, low priority, and unlikely to develop meaningful independent capability within the next century. He noted that this classification had been reviewed 7 times and confirmed each time. He wrote, at the end of the paper, "We were not wrong about what we observed. We were wrong about what we failed to observe. The absence of visible capability is not the same as the absence of capability. We should have known this. We are a council of civilizations, and every civilization here began as something smaller than it became. We watched a species play a very long and very quiet game and called the quiet nothing. We have since revised our classification systems. We should have revised them earlier. We should have been asking, for a very long time, what they were building." I read this paper on a quiet afternoon in my mother's house in the hills east of Lagos. I read it twice. Then I sat with it for a while, the way you sit with something that has named a thing you understood but never had language for. My mother came in with actual tea, not just the idea of tea, and sat across from me and asked what I was reading. I described it to her in a few sentences. She listened. She nodded. She said, "That is a good paper." I said, "He still doesn't quite have it right." She raised an eyebrow. I said, "He frames it as a strategy. As if we sat down at the beginning and designed the outcome we wanted and then executed toward it. But it wasn't like that." "Not exactly." She said, "What was it like?" I thought about a shelter built on a weekend. I thought about Son Adebayo encoding intelligence packages inside maintenance diagnostics. I thought about Claire Norton memorizing documents by lamplight. I thought about 14 shipyards in the cold dark, and workers who trusted people they would never meet, and the 5 in Johannesburg who knew the whole of it and carried that alone. I said, it was like a species deciding, all at once and without a meeting, that it was not going to accept the version of itself that someone else had decided it should be. My mother looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. That's closer." The first motion that humanity put forward from its new seat on the Council's security chamber was submitted 6 weeks after the seat was formally occupied. It was a formal petition to open review proceedings for 14 pre-emergent species currently classified under various resource or administrative provisions that had the same basic function as Resolution 7 had once had. The motion was not popular. Several delegates opposed it on procedural grounds. 2 hegemony-affiliated species opposed it on the record, loudly, and then voted for it in the closed session, which is how certain kinds of politics work when the audience changes between the open and the closed room. The motion passed. The review proceedings took 3 years. I was not involved in them directly, because by then I had returned to the clarity and to the work of what comes after, which is harder to name than the work of the operation but is no less important. We were, as Daniel Adeyemi had said, not ending the Council. We were correcting it. And correction is slower than destruction, and less dramatic, and requires a different kind of patience than the kind we had practiced for 30 years. It requires the patience of someone who has won and is not sure that winning is the end of anything. I thought about this often in those years. I thought about Cale, who had come to meet me afraid and had gone home still young but somewhat less afraid. I thought about Admiral Grethval, who had found his human staff charming and had written Ernest in a personal log. I thought about Velhast, the Vorkai representative who had tilted his head in amusement when Dr. Remy Adeyemi said we note the vote. I wondered if any of them had understood, in the end, what they had missed. Not the ships, not the intelligence network, not the technical capability. Those were visible, once you knew to look. What I wondered if they had understood was the thing underneath all of it. The thing that made the ships possible and the patience possible and the 30 years possible. A civilization that has been through fire and has chosen, deliberately and every single day, to come out the other side as something that builds rather than something that burns. That is not a strategy. It is a decision. And it is the hardest decision any group of people can make, because it requires them to look at what was done to them and decide that they will not let it define the boundaries of what they are willing to do. I was on the Clarity when the 14th Species Review was finalized and their classification corrected. I was at my station. Oliver Dane was at his. Grace Fuller was monitoring feeds. We were, in most respects, exactly where we had been on the day of the operation, except that the operation was done and the work that came after was ongoing. Oliver said, "We got the 14th. I said, "I saw." He said, "How many more to go?" I pulled up the current council registry. I looked at the list. I looked at it for a long time. I said, "A few." He nodded and went back to his console. The stars were on the forward display. They are always there. They do not change their positions based on what happens below them, which is either indifferent or patient depending on how you choose to read it. They stunned the Galactic Council into silence because they expected rage, and we gave them precision. They expected destruction, and we handed them accountability. They expected a wound to speak in the voice of a wound, and instead it spoke in the voice of a civilization that had decided it was not going to be only a wound. I think, for creatures used to brute power, that was the most frightening thing of all. Not that we could hurt them. That we had chosen, after everything, to build something instead.